Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the SafetyGraphics workshop at our Pharma 2021. We're going to start off with an introduction to the project and then jump into lots of hands-on examples and exercises. So SafetyGraphics is sponsored by the Interactive Safety Graphics Working Group, which is a sub-team of DIA and ASA, and we have lots of really great contributors from across the clinical trial space, including pharma, regulatory agencies, CROs, academia, et cetera. We have a set of guiding principles that I want to briefly mention. So everything we build is open source. We really focus on having a highly collaborative environment, and that includes across all those different companies, but also across sectors of our work. So we have lots of clinical and non-clinical people on the team. We have clinicians who help to guide the tools we build, and then we have the technical folks who actually go and build them. And I think that's been really beneficial. Everything we build is interactive. We try to make it really easy to use. In general, you just need a web browser to run the tools, and it's all highly configurable, which you'll see today. Everything is data standard compliant, although data standards are generally not required to use the tool. So you'll see that more as we go through the workshop. Our intent is to be agile and have quick releases, and we do that to some degree, sometimes better than others, I suppose. And then we really want to engage with users and get frequent feedback and keep everything open. We use GitHub for almost everything. So this workshop, all the content is in our GitHub organization, which is at github.com/safetygraphics. But that page includes kind of source code control for all our projects, version control, a lot of our testing and QC infrastructure, issue tracking, release tracking, project management stuff, continuous integration, and everything. Really, we try to use GitHub as much as we can, keep meeting minutes on GitHub. So yeah, even if you're not interested in fully joining the working group, you can certainly follow along on GitHub and go start projects and take a look at our meeting minutes and things like that if you want to know what's going on. If you do want to get more involved, we have a sign-up form. It's just a simple little Google form where you can give us your email and ask any questions, and we have occasional email updates. Or if you really, if after the working group you think this sounds interesting and you want to do more, we're always looking for technical contributors. So yeah, we'd love it to get more involved. So this link is in the slides and on the website. So feel free to shoot us an email. We'd also love feedback on the workshop. So there is kind of just a comment field on this. So yeah, if you have comments on anything from the workshop, how we can make it better, you can ping us directly or use that form. Okay, so I wanted to give a brief history of how we got kind of where we are in the life of this project. And I kind of stole some slides from a previous presentation here. So I've been working on interactive graphics with Becca and Spencer and others since 2012 or so. And our primary focus at the beginning of this effort was really to just create interactive graphics instead of static graphics. And then in 2018, I joined this open source working group, and we really started to broaden the focus and shifted our focus more towards R. Shiny didn't exist in 2012. So a lot has changed since we started this effort. And I think in 2018, it became very clear that R was a serious, a really important tool in clinical trials, and that includes for interactive graphics. So we really focused on building out an R package. And then the last couple of years, in 2019, we did a version 1 release of the package, and Becca presented R in Pharma. And then in just earlier this year, we released version 2. So between version 1 and version 2, we really focused on building out a robust technical framework. And a lot of the presentation today focuses on that and talks about how this can be used for different use cases in our work. Our next focus moving forward, I think, is more about building production workflows, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a minute. So again, the first phase here was focused on creating interactive graphics, and we published a paper on this, the link's on the website. These were all JavaScript based. So at first we were building straight up web pages to do this work. And then when we joined the working group, we created this hepatic safety explorer. And since we had all this great clinical input, we also built a, the doctors on the team put together this amazing clinical workflow for how to use the tool in different use cases. So the links to all this are in the slides, and the slides are in the GitHub repo. But this really kind of took it to the next level. We recently wrote a paper summarizing this, and then we also released version 1 of the SafetyGraphics package. And like I said, in 2019, there are a lot of good things about version 1 of the package. And I encourage you to go back and watch Becca's presentation and my presentation from the last 2 years if you want more kind of an overview of what SafetyGraphics is and why we built it and how it works for the package. But there were also some updates needed after version 1. So version 2 expands it to cover multiple data domains. It expands it to different chart types. It makes it a lot easier to export the app and save things. And then it builds out kind of a more robust testing framework as well. So, and you'll see a lot of this as we go through the examples today. Everything we're going to do today is using the newly released version 2 of the app. This slide just briefly talks about how the package has been used over the last few years. There's maybe 10 or 15,000 downloads of the package from CRAN. So it is out there being used from the RStudio CRAN. I think the main 2 use cases are data exploration by technical users. So a technical user will download the tool, load in their data, and just kind of explore a bit. I know there are also use cases where medical monitoring has happened in a more formal way using the widgets. So using the graphics, maybe not as much using the SafetyGraphics package as a whole, although I think that has happened on a smaller scale as well. There's also, in his keynote at our Pharma last year, Doug Robinson from previously at Novartis gave a really nice example of using some of the graphics for a data monitoring committee, and actually wrote a paper about that. So I think I have a link to that on the webpage as well if you want to see that use case for these interactive graphics. I think there are other possible use cases as well, risk-based monitoring, if you use the tools in a slightly different way. There has been lots of talk about what it would take to include interactive graphics in a submission to a regulatory agency. And there actually has been a practice submission using a tool not unlike some of the outputs from SafetyGraphics. Those are all Fuse working groups, and I can provide those links if people are interested. I think we're still a ways away from a full-on submission, including something like SafetyGraphics, although some of that foundation is being laid by these working groups, which I think is really encouraging. Yeah, so here are those 3 papers together with links, including that data monitoring committee paper. This slide is just a brief discussion of what we think the next steps for the package are. And honestly, it might be better to talk more about these at the end, so I'm not going to get into them in great detail now. But I hope you will agree that it's now possible to add lots of new charts to this SafetyGraphics framework. And we will explain exactly how that works today. And hopefully you all maybe would even go and create some of these charts. That's what we would really love, is to have kind of community involvement here and have people building charts for the package that everybody can use. So that's a big focus now, is really to build out the chart library. There's also a lot of talk about qualification, and our validation hub and others are doing really great work laying out what that looks like. There's a Fuse working group that I think has a really nice framework called Val Tools that they've used, that the folks at Atorus have used for tPlier, that kind of wraps up the qualification documentation as part of the package, which I think is really nice. So I think we're going to explore that. and try to figure out ways to help streamline the qualification process for SafetyGraphics. It's still always going to be, like, qualification is always going to be based on intended use and be organization specific to some degree. But I think providing some documentation, as there's some other packages have done, can really help make that an easier process. So that's something we're thinking about a lot. And finally, there's a lot of just technical details about using the package in production or using the charts from the package in production. So I think we have a technical FAQ that has some discussion of those technical considerations that folks can go and peruse, but things like security, data pipelines, all of that, I think we've tried to build the app so there is a lot of flexibility there, but when the rubber meets the road, you kind of have to work out the details. And I think having some pilot deployments, possibly where the working group collaborates with interested organizations and tries to figure out how to make this work in specific use cases, will be really valuable. So that's another thing we're thinking a lot about in the coming years. Okay, the next thing I want to mention is, as we're going to start getting more into the details of SafetyGraphics, I think that is enough background for now. You're going to get to go play with the app in just a second, so I'm not going to demo it right now. There are 4 vignettes that we've spent a lot of time on, and these have been entirely rewritten for version 2. So these are all included. They're included in the CRAN release, but they're also the most recent updates we track in the GitHub wiki associated with the SafetyGraphics package. So if you want kind of the bleeding edge updates that have happened since we pushed to CRAN, you can always go to the wiki. So 4 vignettes. One is just an introduction of the package, describing the basic use of what goes on once you have the package started. There's a very detailed chart configuration vignette, which I think we're going to cover a lot of that content today. And that would be a really good reference if after the workshop you want to dig more into the possibility of creating your own charts. I'd say the chart configuration vignette's a good place to start there. We also have a cookbook vignette, which is another good resource to kind of refresh your memory after today. So this is just a series of quick examples showing how to initialize the app in different scenarios with different data sets, with different, all sorts of different ways. And honestly, a lot of the content from the code book is covered in the workshop today. And finally, there's that technical FAQ discussing security validation and other technical topics. Okay, cool. And this is the last introductory slide, and then we're going to jump in and start playing with our Studio Cloud instance. So we talk about SafetyGraphics, the SafetyGraphics package, but really there's a kind of an ecosystem of packages that have been created as part of version 2. We've tried to kind of separate out the interests involved here. So the quickest way to explain it is that the SafetyGraphics platform displays charts from the safety charts package, right? So SafetyGraphics is really now pretty much just the Shiny app and some helper functions. None of the charts themselves live in SafetyGraphics anymore. So none of the charts you see today, that code does not live in SafetyGraphics. It now lives in safety charts. And we'll explain, we'll get into this in a lot more detail later. But that's a kind of a key point to keep in mind as we move forward. And then we also have created this safety data package, which just takes the Fuse, Atom, and STM data sets and wraps them up and saves them in the standard R package format to make them a little bit easier to access on CRAN. So you don't have to, load them directly every time. So that's just a little convenience package. And all it is the Eli Lilly study from a few years back that everybody uses for all package development. It's a really, really nice resource. Okay. And with that, I think we are ready to jump into the workshop. I talk about what the difference between these first 3 are, I suppose. Beautiful. All right, thank you. Okay, well, this is really helpful. So my summary of the poll is that we've got a lot of fairly advanced users, but certainly a few folks who are newer to R, and a lot of people who've never seen SafetyGraphics before. So that's actually really helpful to know. All right, perfect. So we're going to go ahead. We're 30 minutes in. That's pretty good. We're going to go ahead and start using the app. So let's try running this thing here in just a minute. There are really two ways to, probably more, but there's two basic ways to run the SafetyGraphics app. There's two functions built into the package. So you're going to install the package. All of this is already done in the project, by the way. The setup and all the package installation and library calls have already been run. And I did install kind of a specific commit of the SafetyGraphics package. So I'd suggest not installing or calling any library calls during the course of the workshop today. Although if you do, it's not the end of the world. So two ways to run the SafetyGraphics package. The first is this SafetyGraphics app call, and this is what we're going to use almost exclusively today. And we're going to talk in great detail about the parameters here. But if you call it with no, you don't pass anything to it at all, it's going to use that default views data, the Atom version of that views data, and it's going to create the set of default charts from that safety charts package. So we'll run that in just a second. The other way to start the app is calling the SafetyGraphics init function. And I'd like y'all to play with this in just a minute, just to get a feel for it, but we're really not going to focus on it today. In fact, it probably needs a little bit more development to get to, full functionality. But the intent here is to have a fully point and click way to start to load your data into the app and to pick your charts. So I think it is worth a little bit of time, and we're going to go to a breakout in just a minute, and everybody can play with the SafetyGraphics init function for just a minute or two. Before we do that, let me just show you how the RStudio Cloud is set up and kind of what we have in our materials today. So you can see in the root of the project, there's a bunch of R files with numbers on them. So those are going to correspond to kind of sections of the workshop, starting with the Hello World section that we're in now. And as you can see, this has the code to run that SafetyGraphics app function and the SafetyGraphics init function directly. So all you do, highlight that, run it, and then in a new browser tab, you should get an instance of the standard default SafetyGraphics app with a mapping tab, a filtering tab, a drop-down with a dozen charts or so, and then a settings page. So I'm not going to go through this. I'll let y'all look at this with your TAs in just a minute in the breakout rooms. But to stop it, you're just going to click on stop down here in your R console, and that'll get you your cursor back. And then if you want to run the next example, just highlight it and run it. But yeah, you found our one known bug already. So that's good.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. It sounded to me like most people got to play with the default build, but maybe didn't get a look at the GUI. So I'm going to run it real quick, just take like 5 minutes or something, not even take like 2 minutes, and show y'all what this looks like real quick. So the idea here is that you can pick which charts you want to display, and then you can load data for the domains required for those charts. And this is a little bit of a sneak preview for some of the content we're going to get into next about loading custom data and customizing the charts. But you just drag, like maybe you don't want the Adverse Event Explorer, and maybe you don't want any AE stuff. So I'm going to take all the adverse event stuff out, and you can see this is smart enough to know that, all right, well, now you've removed all the AE charts. You don't need to load adverse event data anymore. You can also select all, remove all, do some basic stuff there. And then this is a little module that we did not write. We just took it straight from a package called Data Mods, which is really, really nice. That lets you load data in a Shiny app. And it lets you do it in various ways. So you may have noticed that we just mapped a couple of things from safety data to just load them into the global environment. So that makes it easier, but you can also load things from different packages here. But we're just going to load the demographics data, and let's load the labs data. And then click Run App. And now this is exactly the same app, minus a few charts, because we took them out as that we were looking at before, right? So it's just a simple way for non-technical users to be able to create the app. In version 1 of the app, it only supported lab data, but you could really easily just within the app browse to your data and load it in. And a lot of the clinical users on our team were really kind of sad to see that go. So the SafetyGraphics and Knit workflow is the new way to load your data and customize it. And if people like it, I think it's something we can work on making a little bit more robust in the future. But for now, that's the other. I just wanted to make y'all aware that this exists. Honestly, we're not going to talk about it anymore today, but it's here. And if you want to, a quick GUI to load your data in and create charts, you can use that function as well. All right, so that was our first breakout, and now we're gonna start getting into some of the customizations that you can call on that SafetyGraphics app function. So this is all documented in the package, right? So if you just do !SafetyGraphics app, you're going to get a set of, kind of technical documentation for what the options are and the defaults. So you can see for domain data, for example, the defaults are pulling the Atom data from that safety data package. And then we're going to go through much of the rest of this for the rest of the workshop. There are really 4 important configurable inputs and then a couple of other technical tweaks you can make. But the 4 inputs are what we're going to spend the rest of the time today talking through. These are really like the puzzle pieces for what the app uses to generate the charts. So those 4 inputs are domain data, which is the domain level study data that you could see us selecting in the init function there. A mapping, so that's a list identifying the key columns and fields in your data set. And these 2 inputs are really study specific. They're generally gonna change from study to study. Maybe sometimes a mapping might be reused, but in general, that's not necessarily the best way it's not necessarily best practice to reuse it across a whole bunch of studies. So yeah, those are the first 2 we're gonna focus on. And then you can also have general inputs that are used across multiple studies. So the charts, for example, like we want these charts to be able to run across a wide variety of studies. So we're going to define charts in such a way that they can be reused. And then there's also a metadata table that has information about the required columns and fields. And you may have noticed that a lot of the content in the mapping tab was already filled out. That is because you can define data standards in this metadata table as well. So you can kind of tell the app that, if you, for ID column, if you see a column in the data called uSubject ID, just autofill it. And that'll do it for you, right? So that's already built in. Some kind of basic intelligence mapping can be built into the app by default. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. So we're going to go through these one by one. But before we do that, here's a picture, a kind of a schematic of how all these puzzle pieces fit together, perhaps. So you have your domain data, you have your charts, and then the mapping and metadata kind of fit together a little bit because they're both defining how the columns and fields in your data are associated with the charts. So you're going to pass all of these things into that SafetyGraphics app function. Shiny is going to work its magic, and you're going to get your web page with lots of nice interactive graphics, and you can export either copies of the graphics, or there's also a way that I'll show you in a minute that you can just export the whole Shiny app so that it can be easily rerun. So this is kind of the big picture, and hopefully by the end of the workshop today, this will make a lot of sense and you'll kind of know how to go and customize this for your own use cases. So we're going to start with those study-specific customizations. And the first one I want to talk about is domain data. So this lets you pass study data to the app, and domain data is a named list of data frame, or tibbles are fine too, objects. So this is what the default domain data, again, is from safety data, and it's getting the Atom data domains. Each item in this list stores a single data domain, and then additional data domains can be added using that meta property, which we're going to talk about last in section 5 of the workshop. But you can add additional data domains. Labs, AEs, and demographics are included by default, but we'll show you how to add more in the end. And let's just jump in and gain a little experience with these. Please feel free to follow along. We're just going to do this part together. So I'm just going to run them. So this is going to be O2 custom data. In the slides, you'll notice there's these yellow boxes at the top that kind of tell you which file we're working on whenever we jump over to the code. So we're going to go to O2 custom data first here. And if I can get there, okay, perfect. So let's open O2 custom data. Scroll to the top. Maybe I can make this bigger. Y'all see this halfway decent? Get a little bigger. Don't need that right now. Okay, so the first example is we're just going to run the app. Is there an easy way to hide the toolbar? Maybe not. That's okay. Oh, here's the RAM. Sorry, I'm going to stop clicking randomly. All right, so first, let's just load in the SDTM data from that same project instead of the Atom data. So to do that, we're going to use this domain data option, and we're going to pass this list of data frames. And we're going to use kind of the same naming convention that's used in the default. So let's just run this. App should pop up. Go to the mapping tab. You can see it's all filled in again, even though there are some differences here in the defaults. In our breakout, somebody noted that there was no unit column in the Atom data because it's merged on with the parameter name. But in Atom, there is a unit column, so that's auto-filled here. Or sorry, in SDTM, there is a unit column, so that's auto-filled. So that's kind of a small difference between them. And the charts are going to look very, very similar, but in the AE chart, for example, there's an additional column because there's a screen failure group included in SDTM that's removed for Atom, right? So there are some kind of minor differences in the charts, and they just kind of run the same old nice automatic way because that SDTM data standard is already included in the metadata. So that's all there is to that one. We're not going to belabor it. We've already played with the app. It looks pretty similar, but now we've loaded some other data in there. The app is smart enough to know if you just pass it one or two data domains to just include charts from those data domains. So this little toy example, we're going to make a list of data that's really just the labs data. So we'll run that. And then we'll run the app with passing again as domains data or just labs object, which is a list of data frames. And now you look at the charts, and it's a slightly shorter list, and it's only lab charts. So again, charts are going to look the same, but it was smart enough to know that you just want to look at labs. Let's jump back to our studio. stop this one. Okay, so a slightly different use case here is, let's say I don't have my, like I'm working on actual study data and I have SAS data, or maybe SAS transport data, or I have whatever, my data's in a database. The workflow there is slightly different, but it's really the same logic, right? So what you still need to create a list of data frames. And since this is an R function that takes parameters, you just do that before you call the function. So to import a SAS transport data set, we're going to use the Haven package, which if you've worked with SAS in SAS files in R, you'll know is kind of a lifesaver. And this read export function will load the SAS transport function. And I'm just pointing this at a URL. This is actually the source for the data that's in safety data. So we'll just run that, and then we'll just call head of XBT labs real quick. And you can see it's the same, it's the same data we've been playing with. And calling this is going to give us the exact same displays that we had last time, since it's lab data only. So this logic can apply in lots of different ways, right? Like you could use dbplyr to pull data out of a database and then pipe it in here. And you could set up pipelines like this in the context of deploying this to RS Connect, your internal instance of RS Connect. You can hit your database and then run it, and you're going to have nightly runs from your database, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, there's a lot of details to work out for a workflow like that, but we've tried to design this so that it's theoretically possible to load data from basically any data source that R can easily support, and build out your data flows that way. Let's see, we're going to do one more example here, or I think, yeah, okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about, we're going to jump back to the slides for just a minute and talk about this mapping parameter. And then we'll do one more example, and then I think we have another breakout. So the mapping parameter is a way to, well, maybe I'll pause real quick. Are there any questions about any of this? Does this all make sense? Y'all still with me? Okay. Good deal. Okay, so let's talk about mappings. So the mapping parameter for the SafetyGraphics app is another one that's generally speaking going to be study specific. And this is a list that predefines the columns and fields found in the domain data that you just passed. There's no default for this one. So in general, if you don't provide a mapping, it's just not going to use a mapping. The custom mapping looks a little bit like this, where you have a list of your data domains again, and then you have a list defining custom mappings. So, I mean, this one's a little silly because it's using the defaults, but here maybe your measure column is not called param, but it's called custom measure call for whatever reason. That's what the spreadsheet that your lab sent you named it as. So you can do that as part of a mapping. And then this will just get preloaded on the mapping tab, just like those data standards were pre-applied. The mappings are going to get pre-applied as well. And the mapping is going to take precedence over the data standard. So you can overwrite a data standard using a mapping. And this just talks a little bit about that auto mapping using the common data standards, but the mapping takes precedence. And then lots of metadata about about the ID call, measure call, et cetera, are saved in that meta parameter. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So let's just do one quick example with a mapping. Stop that. And we're gonna, so using kind of tidyverse syntax, we're just gonna mess up our default Atom data a little bit. So this is just our default Atom data, and we're gonna rename use subject ID to just lowercase ID, right? So it's no longer gonna match our standard. And I'm gonna run this without the mapping real quick, just to show you what happens. So if we run it without the mapping, the ID column just isn't filled in. So it's not the end of the world, right? You can still go in here and pick your ID and you've done the mapping yourself. But if you have a totally non-standard data set, this can be a bit of a pain to do for every single column every time you open the app. So the mapping helps you to avoid that pain point a little bit. So let's stop this. And so let's tell the app that we have a custom mapping for this ID column. We want it to be called ID. And then we're going to define that like this, and we're going to pass it in as the mapping parameter. So we're going to run that. And as I think you might guess, ID is now pre-filled, along with all of the standard things that are already found there. No unit column because we're backing at them. And the charts work as normal, right? Nothing new or crazy in the charts here. All right. So I think with that, we're going to go let you all try to load some custom data and do a mapping with our second breakout. So this breakout is going to be using, let's see if I can get my files back. We're going to be using O2 exercise. And then if you want to jump ahead, there's O2 solution that shows you how to do it. But go ahead and get O2 exercise opened up, and I'll hand it off to the TAs that people came up with, that any of the TAs want to add in. That would be great as well. So let me reshare. Okay, so I've also bumped up my memory usage, so we're going to be good to go here. All right, so let's open. I'm just going to run it from the solution just to streamline this because it's almost break time. Okay, so here's the solution. And again, really the only pieces that are different are you needed to fill in the bilirubin field value from the data, and then you needed to fill in the normal range values. So one way to do this, to figure this out, would be to kind of like we did in the other example, is just run this with the data without the first I need to download to load the data. So load the data set and then run it without the mapping. Honestly, I think you could run it with the mapping and it wouldn't hurt anything. And then you can go here, and if you click this show data preview, you get a little side-by-side view, and you can take a look at your data here. This doesn't really get you to total bilirubin, but you can also just, always do it manually and see it there. And then here, it might give you an idea that these are the high and low, limit of rejection. So I'm just doing it by hand real quick here, right? And then you can fill this in. You can just go and type these values in yourself. You can also kind of poke around in the command line and figure it out. I saw Becca doing some of that. So, if you're more familiar with kind of standard tidyverse programming, you can always do, table custom labs $param. Stop this first. Custom S. And then you see the value and use copy paste, right? So there's various ways to track down the values in this data mapping. But yeah, that's kind of where we were at. I heard one really good question about how did we know that this was a field value, whereas the others were column values. One way to see that in the app is that they're indented under parameter. So that gives you a hint. The other way to tell is to dig into the metadata behind these, because all of this is data driven by that meta table. So I'll show you all the exact kind of parameters in that metadata table that define what is a column mapping versus what is a field mapping. So that's one way to do it. But the easiest way to tell is kind of this visual indentation here. We also try to use the naming convention that values indicate fields and call indicates a column. So that's just our naming convention we use in the kind of standard metadata. And then we're obviously trying to reuse these mappings across different charts. So that's fairly standard. So that also is intended to give you a hint that, you know, these are field values and these are column values. Okay, I think the last piece before our first break is talking a little bit about how to export. And this looks like these slides got a little shuffled, but that's okay. So we're going to talk about how to export things. So I'm just going to jump back and run the app. I'll just show you in the app the standard ways of exporting content. I'm just going to run Hello World. Okay, so you probably noticed, and we talked about how it's not working great sometimes, the export functionality in the header for each chart. So you can download an R script, or you can download an HTML report. And I'm just going to go ahead and download both, and they did work for me, so that's good news. And then let's just open these up, and it's probably going to open on my local RStudio, but that's fine. Pull this over here. So this is what the export looks like for the R code. And notice this does not actually require SafetyGraphics, right? The SafetyGraphics content is not needed to run this outside of the Shiny app. You have a mapping, a rather long mapping. It just takes the whole mapping. Like a lot of this is redundant, but that's okay. You don't have SafetyGraphics to figure out the mapping for you anymore. So it just exports the whole thing. But basically, it's just the data standard. And then you go through, this is an HTML widget. So you kind of have to have some magic to make the widget work. But this is the exact same code that's run behind the scenes in the SafetyGraphics package. And if you just run this with any luck, you get the chart. So now you have a standalone version of our AE Explorer. Except it's being weird for some reason, like popped up and then went away. But if it wasn't being weird, you have a standalone version of the AE Explorer. There we go. First bug of the day. The other way to do it is that HTML report. Let me just close my local RStudio so my mind doesn't melt trying to jump between them. So this is the HTML report, and this is just a markdown generated report of the table we exported, the widget we exported, and then it also has the code that you can copy paste here. The other piece of functionality, let me do some tab cleanup here. The other way to do exports is through the settings tab. So all of these puzzle pieces, we've tried to have them really well documented over in this settings area. So this is the current mapping, and actually this is the metadata chunk. So this is really the last column here that's highlighted called current is really the current mapping value. And the rest of this is the metadata table that we're going to talk more about later. And just as a sneak preview, you'll see column key and field key. And there's a type variable that tells you whether it's a field or a column mapping. So that's how the way you can tell within the app. Here's the chart metadata, which we're going to talk more about in a little bit. Here's another way to preview the data. But really the main thing that I think maybe is the most valuable here is this code section. So you can actually download a zip that contains code to reinitialize the app that wraps up all of the data and the settings files. They're saved as in the YAML format, but these are just the same, like the same mapping that we were just looking at, saved as a text file. And you can scroll down and see what all this content looks like. You can copy specific pieces to the clipboard. So, a very common workflow for me when I'm trying to do something in SafetyGraphics is to come into the app first and then come over to this tab and just grab the chunk I need to customize or to test a new piece of functionality or whatever, and let the app create it for me instead of trying to figure it all out by myself. And then again, you can just download a zip here. If you've done a bunch of customization in the UI, you don't want to deal with figuring out how to code it. You can always just download this. And then when you go and you open up this init app.r function, you just click run and your app is going to reinitialize and it's going to look like it did when you closed it. There is an optional exercise that we're not going to do today, but that is exercise 3 that asks you to export the code for the Hepatic Explorer and then customize it. I think it's a valuable thing just to take a look at because there's a lot of functionality for these charts that is not easily customizable through SafetyGraphics. So I think in general, SafetyGraphics will get you like 80% of the way there. And then if you really want to fine tune a chart for use in production, you might need to export it and customize it and run it on its own, or make kind of a custom implementation of the chart in SafetyGraphics. So this exercise 3 demonstrates how that works. So it's something you can take a look at on your own time if you are interested. And with that, I believe we are at our break. So let's take 10 minutes. We'll regroup at 10:45 Eastern, so 11 minutes. And then we'll get into, after the break, we'll get into creating custom charts and look more at this metadata object. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions or chat about anything people want to during break. But we'll kind of restart the workshop at 10:45 Eastern in 11 minutes from now. So thank you.
If you want to grab some coffee or get up, I can play some music during the break and then pick back up here in 10 minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, if nobody has questions, that's fine with me.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
If you want to clarify in that workflow, so suppose I'm in a data monitoring committee and using this SafetyGraphics app, and but ultimately we want to make sure that it's a valid output that they're looking at and not just something exploration. Then what it seems like the suggestion would be we can download the code and actually run and produce the output just with the code from the app. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So right now, kind of as I mentioned up front, the app itself, like we do extensive QC and code review and testing as we're developing this. So we're not just throwing things out there by any means, but it's not fully qualified or validated.
Yeah, it's hard to fully qualify an app and interactive inputs and whatever. But if I think that's a great feature that you can grab. You can grab the state of the app, all the inputs, all the mappings, and the code to generate a particular graphic, and then you've got it bulletproof, right?
Yeah, and that's really one of our big focuses in version 2 is the workflow that you're describing now. So you actually don't need the app, right? You can run it totally independent of SafetyGraphics. You don't even need the package. You just run the chart. And then you're getting a lot closer to your stat validation and quality control SOPs than your software development SOPs. And
but the app itself is good for the real-time discussion with the DMC, and then once they reach a conclusion, hold on a minute while I just run this to verify what you've seen is real.
Yeah, and quite honestly, like a lot of the underlying code is written in JavaScript and
Mm-hmm.
doesn't even need R. Like in some of the production uses of this code is more in a traditional web stack than in an R Shiny development workflow, right? So there's a lot of flexibility on what you do with these charts once you've got them created using.
Okay, but the chart itself, I can have, say, static versions of it produced just with R code, or is it including JavaScript code?
Each chart is different. So a lot of the charts, and I'll talk more about this in the next section when we're going to talk about making custom charts. So a lot of the charts right now are created with HTML widgets, which is a package that lets you take JavaScript code and run it in R and run it in Shiny really easily and put it into HTML reports with our Markdown, etc. So pretty much almost all the charts here are HTML widgets, and it specifies in the dropdown which ones are HTML widgets. And if it's an HTML widget, it means there's JavaScript code behind the scenes.
Okay.
One way or the other. Tendril Plot, this isn't actually running. Tendril Plot, for example, here, let me show you this. You can run static charts that are created with ggplot and other similar libraries, and I'll show several examples of that in the next section. Okay. But in the demo here, there's this Tendril package that I really like, and this is just a static plot. And if you look at the script here, it's pretty much just a normal old R script that you might use to create a chart, and then you could customize it as you see fit, right? So the answer is yes, you certainly can have static ggplot code that's deployed to this app to make, to generate this initial code base, and then customize it and validate it like you would any other figure.
Okay, but the Java, so the HTML widget outputs, those are still good to send to health authorities if we need be.
My recommendation would be to follow your stat SOPs for them. So what I would do is generate this, and again, this is kind of no warranties or anything like that included with any of this, but the workflow that I would suggest exploring with your organization would be to create the R script to generate the code standalone, and then consider how to best QC the HTML document that is created. So for example, you would get a standalone page with something like this adverse event explorer, and to QC this for a single study, I might pick, you could program the whole thing, right? Like this would just be a 50-page PDF if it were non-interactive. So but you could also just pick a few views, and you could pick, I want to generate, you could write in fact, I have written a SAS macro that we have used for this exact purpose. I could actually share that if anybody's interested. But I would double program this to some extent and QC it before sending it to a DMC. Okay. That would be my general recommendation, but it's just going to depend on your organization's SOPs and all of that.
Yeah, we're still figuring things out.
Everyone is. We are too, in my day job. So
okay, thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, of course.
Or 15 minutes or so of the workshop. And Jeremy, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Phil. All right, y'all. So let's jump right in and talk about making some custom charts. So this will get a little bit more interesting and a little bit more complex, but I think we're ready. So I'll share my screen. Presentation mode. All right. So we're going to start now talking about customizations that will apply to multiple studies, right? The idea is one of the design principles for SafetyGraphics and this package is we want to make it easy to generate these charts across a wide range of studies and using a wide range of data formats. So that means there are some special considerations that you have to take into account when creating a chart for use in the SafetyGraphics package. And all of this is controlled by a somewhat complex charts parameter for the SafetyGraphics app function. So charts is a list. It has one item per chart, and it defines which charts are used in the app. The charts defined in that safety charts package are included by default. And we're going to talk more and start to look into safety charts a little bit more as we go through this section. A lot of different types of charts are supported, as we were talking about a little bit during the break. So there's HTML widgets, shiny modules, and then static charts and tables. And we've even managed to have RTFs generated by charts in the app. So that's pretty cool too. Users can create custom charts by defining a configuration object and a chart function. And we're going to talk a lot about exactly what that means. The custom chart vignette is your friend here. It really goes through all of this in a lot of detail. We're actually going to go in and update it quite a bit after the workshop to include some of the new content we've generated for this discussion. So we'll do a new release, a version 2.1 release of SafetyGraphics sometime relatively soon that refines this and includes a lot of these additional details that we're discussing today. So let's talk about this chart object. First of all, the charts saved in that safety charts package, so again, there's a configuration object for every chart, and then there's a charting function for every chart. And this is our list of charts in safety charts. So the configuration objects are saved under the inst config folder, and you can see this big long list. Now let's zoom in and look at, so the AE Explorer, the AE timelines, all those charts that we've been looking at today. This is kind of the metadata that defines them are saved here in the safety charts package. So zooming in, let's just look at an example for the safety histogram. So you've seen that histogram where you can kind of toggle through and look at the the distribution of each different lab in the data set. So this is what the configuration for safety charts looks like this. It's saved as a YAML. This is just a convenient way to define a list in a text file instead of having to use the full list format. It's a little bit cleaner. You may have seen YAML files. They're used fairly often in other packages. HTML widgets uses them. Other packages use them as well for kind of saving configurations. We'll go through this in a little bit more detail later, but you can see it's saying what data domain you need to use here. This is for the labs domain. And then there's this workflow chunk. It's saying that this is an HTML widget, right? It's getting a label. It's defining what package the content's coming from. And then there's this workflow object where it's saying, okay, well, the workflow for an HTML widget is pointed at a widget that's stored in a package. And this is a little bit different for each type of chart. And you'll see some more examples of what this looks like. The metadata that's shown at the top of the charts page, you may have noticed, is also defined here. So in this links section, you can include any links you want, and they'll come up in the header for the chart. So here's more detail on that chart specification. This is copied directly from the wiki. I want to point out a couple of these options in particular, because we're going to use them in our examples and in our exercise. And we're going to have a breakout in a little bit where you're going to probably want to use this order parameter for each chart. So order defines the order in which to display the chart. And if order is a negative number, we just drop the chart and it's not shown in the app. So if you load in charts to the app, and it has, in that kind of complicated charting object, it has an order of -1. It's just going to get dropped. The app won't show it. Well, you'll see this more in the example in a second. So, okay, you've got this huge list of charts, you've got these configs, like what on earth do you actually do with these to get them to show up in the app? And the answer is, in general, you're going to want to use this helper function that we define called make chart config. So this is going to convert YAML chart configuration files to an R list. And it's going to work some magic behind the scenes where it takes that workflow function and actually binds the functions used to generate the chart to the list. Some of this, we're just going to wave the magic wand and trust the package. Certainly, if anybody's really interested in this, then we can talk more about the underlying technology and how all this works and how it works in Shiny. We've certainly thought a lot about that. But for now, just kind of the idea is that you call this make chart config function, and it's going to generate a chart object for you that is appropriate to pass to the SafetyGraphics app. Now, make chart config by default is just going to look at the safety charts package. It's going to make sure you've installed it and find it kind of in using the lib path to find out where it lives on your computer. And then it's going to go to the inst config folder, and any YAML files there, it's going to attempt to load up and convert into charts for SafetyGraphics. So that's a general idea. You can also pass it a directory. So if you have custom charts that you've defined that don't live in a package yet, and you've kind of defined these configuration objects after reading through the wiki page and laboring for hours, then you can point it in a directory and it'll load YAML files from there. You can run a few of these, right? You can load the charts from safety charts, and you can make a kind of add another list with files from a directory. I know there's a couple of package developers that are thinking about making their package support SafetyGraphics by default. So maybe in the future, we'll be able to say, make chart config packages equals tplyr, for example. And it'll just automatically, have a set of charts in tplyr that are able to be run in SafetyGraphics. That's certainly something we'd love to see in the future, right? Other packages starting to include these configs there as well. So we're going to jump to examples in just a minute, but just before we do that, here's what it looks like when you run that make charts config function. It's going to try to give you some logical output, right? So this is the default for the SafetyGraphics app function. It's going to call make charts config pointing at safety charts, and it's going to generate this, and it's going to say, okay, well, we found 22 charts in your safety charts location on your computer. Here are the charts we found. And then when you run the app, I'll show you in just a second, you also get some notices about which charts are actually included in your instance of the app that you're running. This is what a chart looks like once it's been generated in that make chart config function. So now I'm just viewing first default charts. And you can see it lines up pretty closely with the YAML. There's a few additional things added, like the path, a name can be generated automatically, just testing if the environment is set up correctly for SafetyGraphics. If this is false, then the chart's going to be dropped. And it actually binds functions here, which I've minimized, but these are actually the functions defined from the workflow that are needed to actually draw the chart in the Shiny app. Okay, so that's a lot, but now let's look at a few examples that hopefully will make this clear. What we're going to do first is just customize the default charts provided from safety charts, right? So that's kind of our first exercise here, and then we're going to create some charts from scratch, right? Some charts that are not included in safety charts or anywhere else. We're just going to define them and add them to the SafetyGraphics app. Let me jump back over. Are there any questions? I'm happy to take questions now. If I've totally lost y'all, let me know.
That's good. Any questions?
Any questions?
All right, I think everyone can go off mute if that's of interest. You can also use Zoom chat if that's better for you, or you can send them to me privately and I can post them for you. Either way works. So
yeah. Okay, so let's do the examples. So again, we're going to run this make chart configs function, and it's going to give us this long list of all the charts created, right? And then you could easily, like, if you want to just run the default, you can just run SafetyGraphics app charts equals charts, and that's just like what we were running before. That's identical to just running SafetyGraphics app, right? But you can also manipulate that charts object a little bit. So for example, let's say we didn't want to run any HTML widgets, like we wanted to include this in a DMC and we don't want to deal with validating interactive graphics like that use JavaScript. So we want to just see what charts are not widgets. So we can run this. This is using the perm library, which makes list manipulation a little bit easier, but you could also run a loop here, or there's lots of different ways to filter a list. But all this is doing is going to keep all the items in the list where chart type is not HTML widget. And then if I run the app with our new not widgets chart list, we're just down to 2 charts. We got a demographics table, and this is the one where you can download an RTF. And we've got our Tendril Plot. So that's all in like the default build right now. Everything else is an HTML widget. I am fairly confident that we're going to have a lot more non-HTML widgets coming up in the next, as we start the next phase of this project. But for now, a lot of the charts are widgets. So this gives you, like, the idea here is you're not going to make a whole new chart, but you want to do some basic manipulation of the existing charts. Let me also show you this real quick. So when you run the app, it's going to be fairly verbose about which charts it is including and why. So here it said, okay, we dropped 4 charts with a negative order parameter. So there's a few charts that we have in safety charts that are kind of for demo purposes or for just we were doing tech demos or exploration, or maybe they're just not really ready for prime time yet, where we have the order set to negative by default. So it lists those, right? Said, okay, well, these were in your chart object, but we're not going to include them because the order is negative. There are a few other reasons charts can be dropped as well, and those will get listed here as well when you start the app. And then it says, okay, well, in the end, we're initializing the app with 2 charts. So there's some checking that goes in when you run SafetyGraphics app to make sure your charts are valid and should run as expected. So let's look at one more example kind of like this, and then we're going to do a quick breakout for another exercise. So again, let's make our default charts. Okay, and now we're going to tweak it. We're going to tweak the metadata for a chart, right? So let's actually just see what this looks like by default. So if you look at charts, AE timeline label, the label is adverse event timeline, then we're going to say no, that is not the label we want. We want a better label like this. And then if we run the app, we now have our greatly improved A timeline label. So there you go. Like, obviously this is a silly example, but you can see, like, you can tweak these charts a little bit just in the command line for your workflow if desired. You can obviously also go in and tweak the actual YAML files if you wanted to, and fork safety charts and mess with it there, but you can also do it by hand to some extent. So let's try an exercise. I think probably 10 minutes again sounds good. We got 50 minutes left. Actually, Xiao, I'm thinking maybe we'll do this exercise together since we're a little bit tight on time, because I really want to do the custom chart exercise. Does that make sense to you, Xiao?
Great. Yep. Let's do it
Okay.
together.
So we're going to do exercise 1 here together. So let's just jump over to that. So feel free to follow along, but we'll do this one relatively quickly together. So our goal here is to initialize an app with all of the custom and experimental charts from safety charts included. And again, I kind of have previewed this, but the order parameter is important here. So does anybody want to be brave and help me with this exercise and kind of suggest an approach? I know several of you, so I'll be happy to call on someone. Let's see. Oh man, I don't know who I want to bother, Preston or Natalia. All right, which one of you want to be brave and try to help me? Preston, Natalia? Anyone? No?
Make chart config.
There, that boy. I like it. All right. So we're going to call make chart config. All right, sweet. So we're going to stop our app first. I like it. You got the first step. You can open the solution file if you have to. All right, so we have make chart config. We already know that there's a few hidden charts. How do you think we might make those charts not hidden anymore, Preston? Any ideas? I'll give you a hint.
Positive?
Hmm.
Didn't you say the order value was negative for those, so make them positive?
I did say that. So yeah, that's exactly right. So how we've got this list of charts and we need to make the order. So let's do metacode, make order positive. How would we do that? Any thoughts, any ideas?
Or you could use poor again.
Yeah, I would rather use per, but I bet everybody could figure this out if I gave them 10 minutes. So like for chart in charts, chart dollar order goes to whatever, right? A big number. And this will do it. This will make all of them positive. They'll all show up. I think there'll be an alphabetical order if we do this. So that'll work. Anybody know the per code? Let's see if I can get it right. So per, probably a better way to do this than per actually, but I always use map for everything. So we'll just do function chart dollar order goes to whatever big number, right? This code is basically equivalent. This and this is more or less the same. I think there's like per crawl or something like that. I might do it, but anyway, this will work. All right, let's try it. So we're gonna make chart, spell it correctly first. Fig. All right. And then we'll just do SafetyGraphics app, charts equals charts. I guess we could call this all charts or something, right? Charts equals all charts. Run it again. And run this. And now we just broke everything. What did we do wrong? Of course, I made it sound easy. Let's try this one actually. I might have to go run the solution. I can never live code.
Hey, Jeremy, I think you might have to return chart or chart.
Oh yeah, I totally do. You're right. Yeah, thanks, Eli. There you go. Good debugging. All right, so let's try it again. Yeah, good call. All right, sweet. So now we have some extra charts, right? Some of these like little proof of concepts we were working on. Here's a shiny module that looks just really bad once it once it runs because it has a million levels in it. But if you like hit delete a bunch of times, it kind of looks less ridiculous. So you can see why these aren't included by default, right? Like we just haven't fine-tuned these. They're mostly tech demos. The abuse I just gave it. Y'all saw the idea, like additional charts showed up after we did that. Yeah, you can see it's still trying to like run geom paths. So there you go. And the solution is in there as well. So let's jump back to the slides. But the whole point of this was like, you can go in and customize the default charts, right? You can do stuff to them. You can show charts, hide charts, lots of different ways to approach this. Now let's get to the fun stuff. Let's talk about how to actually make new charts. This is quoting directly from that chart config wiki. So you're going to need a configuration object and a chart function in general, as I said before. And there's a lot of additional information in the wiki. The chart functions are generally in that config file. You're going to want to have that workflow defined. And there are different items in the workflow that apply to different chart types. So I'm not going to go through this whole rigmarole right now. We're just going to jump into a few examples. But if you want to make custom charts, it's definitely worth looking through this. And we are more than happy to help troubleshoot and support your efforts to add things here. So don't hesitate to reach out if you really want to dive in and do this for real. Well, let's take an example. So here's our chart config. This looks a lot like the ones we saw before, right? So we're just going to define it as a list here instead of a YAML. You got to define the environment, have a hello world name. We're going to label it hello world. This is just going to be a standard static plot. In fact, we're using just like the very base plot function. It's going to use the AE domain, although actually we're not really using any data in this version. We'll use data in a few minutes. And in the workflow, we want it to call a function called hello world. And here's our hello world function. So chart functions, generally speaking, are going to take a data parameter and a settings parameter. So this is going to pass the domain data, and this is going to pass the mapping object. And it's going to pass it as a list in general. And then this function can use the data and settings that are currently loaded in the app, and it's going to run some code to make a plot. This plot isn't actually using data and settings, but you can see here, you can actually run this. So let's jump over real quick to our Studio Cloud. Let's see if it's recovered from the abuse I gave it. Let's go back to our custom charts and just try it. This is our hello world code, right? Same thing that I had in the slides. So we're going to run our hello world plot. Let's see what happens if we just call hello world. There you go. Pretty sweet plot that we made. We're going to define the chart config just like it had in the app. And then we're going to pass that as a chart to the SafetyGraphics app. So we have our hello world chart, and we're going to just pass it in. And here's our app. Hello world. There you go. We've made a custom chart. You're ready to go and take on the world. We didn't change our data or anything here, so you still have the data domains, although they're not being used in any chart. So it's a little bit of a silly example, obviously, but that gives you an idea. Like those are the building blocks for charts. Yeah, that config file and that chart function. Let's look at a slightly more realistic example now. So let's go here. Scroll down. Stop that. Okay. Don't think I had this one in the slides, did I? Yeah, here we go. Yay. All right. So here's a slightly more realistic charting function. So let's make an age distribution chart. And why don't we look at the config first, and then we'll look at the function. So we're going to use the demographics data for this one. This is going to be another simple plot. We're going to have a function called age dist. and called age distribution. And here's what our function looks like. It's a ggplot call. So it's going to take the data. The aesthetics are going to use the settings object. So this syntax is probably the hardest thing that we're going to have to deal with building chart objects. And I do have a slide on this that I'll show you in a second, just kind of talking through this and providing some resources on how to basically, you have to functional programming with ggplot and with the tidyverse is a little bit like there's some additional complexity there. I'm guessing a good number of you already have some experience with this, so this might be totally familiar if you've developed a package or if you developed kind of complicated tidyverse or ggplot code that you wanted to be reusable. But anyway, this chart is going to make a histogram, and we're going to facet it by gender. So it's an age histogram faceted by gender. And then you just call it, right? And we're going to add this one on to our standard chart. So we're going to have charts make chart config, and then we're just going to add an item to the list called age dist, and that's going to be our age distribution chart. Cool. Let's run it. All right, here are our charts, all of our normal charts, and then at the bottom we have our nice, beautiful age distribution. Now, yeah, so that's that. Now, this will work just fine with other data as well. So if we ran that SDTM data, we would get this same chart created, but the distribution looked different, just like the other charts kind of adjust and are reactive, using the shiny terminology, based on your inputs, your data input. So now we've made a real chart. I don't think it's a super useful chart, but it's a real chart that we have added. And this is all the code that was required. It was 20, 30 lines of code to generate this custom age distribution and make it reusable. Let's take a quick jump back to the slides and just talk about making reusable chart functions with the tidyverse. So I'm not going to, this is another, like, people have run whole workshops on this topic. And honestly, there are a lot of different ways to tackle this. But the bottom line is that a lot of tidyverse functions require a lot of tidyverse packages require some modification using functions. We really like using this .data pronoun. I think that's probably the best practice right now. So that's what we tend to use both in SafetyGraphics and safety charts. And this is what a modification, this is pulled directly from, I think, the ggplot vignette down here. So you can see they're modifying this simple function to a slightly more complicated version by passing the data frame and then referencing the column using this .data pronoun. And then when you call it, it generates the same chart. There's a lot of resources about this, like Hadley's Advanced R book goes into it in detail, and then there are vignettes for both dplyr and ggplot that will provide a much, much better explanation than I can. I've probably just recently gotten to the point where I don't just randomly like spam all of the solutions and do bang bangs and double curly braces, and like there's lots of different things to use, but this .data pronoun really works pretty consistently across the different packages. So that's really the recommendation that we would suggest if you want to do this in production. Okay, so we've already gone through 2 of these. Let's do the last one. And then we're going to do an exercise. And you all are going to get to play with this in your small groups a little bit. So the last example, that we're kind of getting more and more robust with our examples here. The last one we're going to do is a spaghetti plot. And you actually saw this when we, in the last exercise, the spaghetti plot that I was showing is generated basically using this code. So this is a chart. Let's look at the labs, the config first. So making a spaghetti plot. It's using lab data, and we're going to link back to the safety charts package here. Another's just static plot. Here's kind of the language we were just talking about, using the data and settings parameters. We're just defining the aesthetics for the plot outside. You can define them in here just as well. This is another way of doing it. I think this is no longer best practice though, using the AEs underscore and as name and all this action. So I won't worry too much about that. And then here's how you create the plots. You pass in those aesthetics, pass in the data, and then you run it and you get settings measure call here. So let me just run this real quick. Let's see, we stopped the last one. Nope. Let's see. Here's the plot. Oh, here it is. There you go. Again, not like we're not following best practice or visualizations here, but it's a chart. It's a thing. With some refinement, you could make this into a usable chart, I think. Okay, so we've done our demographics histogram, we've done our lab outlier explorer. I'm going to show you this last one, but we're not going to get into it, although there were a lot of Shiny developers. So if anybody really wants to see how to do a Shiny module, you can stick around after, and I'll spend another 15 minutes going through this one if you want. Okay, so I'm just briefly going to show you what a module looks like in SafetyGraphics. And anybody who's created Shiny modules, this should be fairly familiar and straightforward. So you define a UI function. All we're really defining here was that sidebar with a multi-select and letting you choose which measures show up in that plot. Then we're going to show the plot. This is just using one of the sidebar layout. And then you have to define your server function as you would for any module. And really all that's happening here are you're setting up an observer that's watching that's watching your selectize input. So this is updating the selectize input based on the parameters that are getting passed into basically like whatever measure column you're selecting in SafetyGraphics is then being used to populate the control in your Shiny app. So you pass in both the data and the settings as a single parameter here. We don't need to get in the weeds right now, but that's generally how it works. So you're going to call params as the reactive, and then settings and data are attached to it. We make a kind of a reactive settings here based on what happens in the input. Then you draw the chart, and then drawing the chart, you're just calling render plot on your charting function that was used in the last example as well. The workflow looks pretty similar. You just the config looks pretty similar. You're just defining UI and server functions instead of that single charting function. You have to provide both. So this is the general workflow for if you want to create a Shiny module here. That's what you have to do. And we could talk lots more about this, obviously, if desired. One drawback of the Shiny module is you cannot export it as a report. You can export the source code and you can kind of run a little standalone Shiny app, but you can't export a standalone HTML report because you don't have R running in that HTML file, so it won't work. Okay. So for anybody who's not a Shiny expert, you can kind of like wipe the last 3 minutes from your memory. For everybody else, we probably need another hour to really get into this, but just a quick taste of what that looks like. All right. I think we are gonna, if I remember correctly, we are going to do our last breakout now. questions about metadata throughout. So we'll introduce it now and start to give an idea for how that last piece of the puzzle works. It's definitely really important. So before we do that, I wanted just to tie a bow on the chart stuff. This is our schema that we've drawn that kind of shows all of the different components that go into a chart. It's not quite like a reactivity diagram that you'll see sometimes when you're building Shiny apps, but it's a little bit similar. So it's broken into different levels, and we're talking about the functions that are used. So starting from the bottom, you can see you have your data and your settings that are passed into a main function, right? And that's the function that draws the chart, as you saw in the config files. And then there's also files that the app needs to know what your UI function, your server function. There's also an optional initialization function, which we didn't really talk about, but you can also kind of do some stuff to your data and your settings objects before passing them to the chart. So that's actually a pretty important part of the workflow that we use quite frequently. So if in advanced use cases, just kind of keep that in mind. So these are all the functions that are involved in a chart, and then that wraps up into the overall chart object for a single chart. And then that wraps up into a list of charts, and then that goes to the app. So this is just kind of the technical diagram that we built as we were building the app to make sure it was all straight in our heads and made sense. So we thought we would just share this briefly as well. It's included in an appendix in the wiki page as well. Okay, so let's, how much time do we have? 15 minutes. Okay, so we'll briefly talk about custom domains, and then some of this content you all can review on your own time, or maybe we'll do another workshop at some point and really dig into custom data domains. We've also talked about maybe doing like a hackathon kind of day at some point where we work on adding charts to the package. So if you're interested in any of that, just go to that sign up sheet and at least join the newsletter, and we'll send out a notification when that's going to happen and when we do more stuff like this. But for now, let's take just 10 minutes and look at custom domains and this metadata object. So meta is really how you capture all of the information around the different data domains. It defines the columns and fields that are used in the charts, and it kind of populates that mapping tab. A default set of metadata is included for A's, labs, and DM, and is saved as a data file in SafetyGraphics. So if you just do a view SafetyGraphics : meta, you will see the default metadata table, and I think we've pulled that up several times now. You could also see it on the app on the settings page under mapping. So yeah, so that's the high level view of the metadata. Here is that metadata again. You can see you have a text key, which is really the key identifier for each parameter. It specifies what domain you're in. That column key is going to be identical to text key, except for these field level mappings where, like I was saying, it's going to point back to the field that you want to look in to populate these values. Column or field for type, then label. And then here's where we define standards. So anytime you have, and this is just a little, I mean, there might be a better way to do this long term, but for now, if you add a column called standard underscore whatever in your metadata table, that's going to be treated as a data standard. And there are a set of functions that are included in the SafetyGraphics package that's going to go through and basically do column matching, right? So it's going to look through the data sets you've loaded and see if any of these columns and fields exist. And then whatever standard has the most matches is the one it's going to pick. And then it's going to fill in that mapping tab for you. It's kind of going to predefine a mapping based on the standards that are provided in this metadata table. You can tell the app not to do this, by the way. I think there's a parameter called auto mapping. If you do !SafetyGraphics app, that will turn this off. But in general, I think it's a very useful piece of functionality, so we leave it in. Here's a !SafetyGraphics : meta will give you a description of each of the expected columns in the metadata. And then you can add additional domains here, right? So by adding rows to your metadata table with a new domain value, you're going to define new domains for use in the chart. So this is kind of, now we're starting to put all of the puzzle pieces together. And I'm going to jump over and at least run a couple of examples quickly in the last few minutes to show you what this looks like. But you can see here, we've defined a new ECG domain. It looks a lot like labs, which is nice. And then we're defining a new chart, and this is pointing at that ECG domain. And then we're going to load a data set, an ECG data set. And this is an actual ECG data set that exists on the web. And then we're going to just pass all of this information to SafetyGraphics app, just like we were before, right? And that's going to create an ECG chart. And I'll show you this in a second for ECG and a few others. So yeah, let's just jump through. I'll try to be quick here and just run through this last set of examples. You can see custom domains like live and in person. I think there are 3 examples here. So the first one, what this is going to do is a little silly, but it'll show you a basic idea. So this is going to just clone the labs domain. So we're going to take our metadata file, we're going to filter out the lab data, and we're going to rename it to vitals. It actually isn't that crazy a thing to do, as all of you probably know the data standards. So they're really not that different in terms of the structure. We're just going to bind that new amazing vitals metadata onto our original metadata. And then we're going to add in the vital sign data from SDTM, and we're going to run the app. So let's run this and see what we get. Okay, so we go to the mapping tab. Hey, vitals. It's got the same exact configuration as a labs, which it doesn't really make sense, right? You're not going to find ALT in vitals unless you really got bigger problems than we're talking about today. But we've loaded it in just fine. It actually, did find a few matches like visit and visit number and ID column matched. So we kind of have a partial atom data set for vitals here, which that's fine. Going to the charts, there's no charts using vitals yet because we haven't defined any charts using vitals. So that's that. This is kind of the only new content here. Our charts and everything else are exactly the same as they have been, but now we've defined a new data domain. So now let's jump back to our examples and talk about how we might use that data domain. And in fact, let's do our hello world, our friendly hello world example refined for its own custom data domain. So what I did here was I defined a standalone metadata file for hello world called hello meta. I used a tribble, which I really like for examples like this. So we're going to have 2 columns in our metadata, the X column, or two column mappings, X call and Y call. They're both in our hello domain, and they're going to control the position of the points on our hello world chart. Okay. Column key is the same thing as our text key, and our type, these are both column mappings. We're not going to do any field mappings. We're not going to mess with the text standard today because we don't have time. We're going to simulate a data set for hello world with X and Y values. Our hello world function is going to be very similar to what it was before, but as we all know how to make reusable charting functions now, we're going to use our newly defined X call and Y call, and our chart object is going to point at the hello world domain and use our hello world function that we've just defined. And then we're going to pass all this to the app. Let's see what happens. All right, mapping. Hello. Our hello domain is here. Hooray. There's our data set. That's what we want. X and Y. We defined a data standard in the example, so it's there. It's pre-filled. Look at our hello world chart. There's a chart. Any guesses what's going to happen if I do this and just make the Y position X? There you go. It works. We're on the identity. So there you go. You've now seen a custom chart in a custom domain with custom data and custom metadata and custom everything. It's fully custom. Yeah, so yay. All the puzzle pieces have now come together. Let's look at a real example real quick in the last couple of minutes here. So a non-hello world implementation of this is also for ECG data. So let's look at this one. And there's a link here to a pull request in GitHub. This is actually an active project for our team, is to build out the ECG domain. There's a big group of clinicians who are very eager to have this. So as part of our prep for the workshop, we figured we might as well do some useful work, and Xiao put together a nice initial set of ECG charts, which I'll show you at the very end. So there's a sample ECG data set in the Atom format. This path that Xiao tracked down. Here's again, zoom out a little so this all goes on one line. Again, we're just kind of defining our metadata object by hand here in the ECG domain. The biggest change here is you have to deal with time points and visit numbers. So that's fine. And then we're going to define a new chart. And actually, all we're going to do here is we're going to load in the safety outlier explorer chart, so the spaghetti chart that we use for lab data, and we're going to just change it and tell it to run on the ECG data. Notice that we're using the same text keys here, right? So we're using value call, measure call, all of it's the same, just the domain has changed. The visit and period stuff is a little bit different, but here I just kind of cheated and said, okay, well, we're just going to use time point as our visit column. So that's probably not best practice. It would probably be better to refine this a little bit, but just for the example, all we've done is we've loaded in our standard outlier explorer for labs and said, nope, we want to call it a QT outlier explorer and we want to run it for ECG. And then we're going to run this. So let's see what happens. Close this. So we loaded that data, go to the mapping, we got ECG data, it's all mapped, visit column is time point, don't tell anyone on us. And go to QT Outlier Explorer, and it spins for a second, or 5, because it's a big data set. And drum roll, don't crash, here you go. Same chart, lab data has now been replaced with ECG data. Fortunately, this chart was smart enough to deal with multiple time points. So I think Spencer programmed this back in the day. So good job, Spencer. And yeah, you can flip through the ECG data and see what's going on. So that's pretty cool. Wasn't so bad, right? To like take some of the existing stuff and deploy it in a different place. And here, look, there's actually like some clinical action going on here where ECG spikes for this person, and you can click on them. Maybe, and see what their other labs look like. Like several of these are spiking here at like 53 hours. So the doctors can go and query this and try to figure out what's going on. I'm going to jump over. Let me see. Do I have that open still? Another tab. Nope, I closed it. All right, hold on one second. I want to show you like Xiao's full implementation of this in the last minute, and then we'll be done. So in the pull request, I had it running. Hold on one second. I might not have it running. Xiao, do you remember the URL for the demo version off the top of your head? Is
Yes,
it in your...
let me text that to you.
Okay, yeah. Here, I might have it. This is the gist.
I just put it in the Zoom chat.
Oh, thanks, yeah. Perfect. So this isn't the final version, but this will give you an idea that like this, the concept we just showed you really scales nicely to a lot of the charts we created. So a lot of the different charts that we created for labs, Xiao went and mapped them over to Qt. And this one you have to show, click this button to make it work for some reason. Like, again, there's like a little bit of fine tuning of the parameters that we'll do for a final production version of this. I think we've actually dealt with that in the PR we showed. But I think it's really a really nice demonstration of the modularity here, that a lot of these charts work with just minor modifications in different data domains. And like, there's no reason, in fact, we will be expanding the, the default build to include Qt in the not too different future, right? Not too distant future to include ECG data. Okay, I mean, I think that's it. If you want to see more of like how Xiao made the magic happen, then go check out this pull request and keep an eye out for a future release of safety charts that'll put all this into production.
All right. Well, we got 2 minutes left. If there's any other questions or thoughts or topics, feel free to post those. You can also reach out to info@rnpharma.com and we can get the questions to the instructors that way. We also got the conference Slack page going, so if you have questions there, you can reach out. So with that, I'd like to thank Jeremy and the team for such an awesome workshop today, and it's amazing to see how far this has come in 2 or 3 years, and how the community has really helped with it, which is fantastic. So we will go ahead and end the recording and end the session here today.
Phil, we're happy to hang out if there are questions. Let's end the recording, but if there's if anybody wants to chat, I'm happy to hang around for another 20 minutes or whatever.
Sounds good. I'll go ahead and end the recording now.